Fat girl said, "I'm not worth fighting for." Mountain man declared war on anyone who hurt her Irondale, autumn of 1891. The Grand Oak Hotel stood like a proud fortress at the center of town, filled with polished oak, brass railings, and the sneers of people who thought themselves better than most. That night, in front of half the town, Beatrice B. Sullivan's life shattered. She had been summoned to the lobby by Marcus Cromwell, the cruel hotel owner with ice in his veins and greed in his eyes. His drunken son, Roderick, leaned against the stair rail, still clutching his head from a scuffle he had started and lost. "She attacked me," Roderick shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Bee. "The fat maid tried to kill me." Gasps filled the air. Bee's face burned crimson, her freckles standing out against her pale skin. "That's not true," she whispered, voice trembling. He cornered me. I was only defending myself." But Marcus Cromwell slammed his hand on the counter. "Enough! You're fired, and I'll see to it no one in this town hires a worthless cow like you again. You're finished." Laughter snickered through the crowd, sharp and merciless. Bee's throat tightened as humiliation pressed her to the ground harder than any fist. She clutched the apron at her waist, eyes stinging. "I'm not worth fighting for," she whispered to herself, barely audible, though the silence in the room carried her words. "I'm nothing." The crowd leaned closer, savoring her collapse. But then, from the doorway, a deep voice cut through the venom like a blade. "You're wrong," it said, low and commanding. "You're worth fighting for, worth declaring war against every man in this town if that's what it takes." All heads turned. A towering figure stepped into the light. Broad shoulders, dark hair streaked with silver, eyes like storm-forged steel. Donovan MacLeod had arrived. Beatrice Sullivan had never known what it meant to belong. At 25, she had become the town's unspoken target, an easy mark for laughter, gossip, and cruel nicknames that stung worse than any lash. Her figure was full, her cheeks dotted with freckles, and her step lacked the elegance of the finely dressed ladies who glided through Irondale's shops. She worked hard, scrubbing floors and making beds at the Grand Oak Hotel, yet her labor bought her little more than ridicule. Every morning she tied her apron tight and braced herself. She heard whispers in the halls, "There goes Cromwell's cow." Children giggled when she passed with trays in her hands. Even guests, wealthy cattlemen, traveling merchants, salesmen flush with coin, felt free to sneer at her. To them, Bee was not a woman, but a joke. Still, she endured. She fed stray cats behind the kitchen door, sewed torn sheets late into the night, and smiled when her heart told her to cry. But humiliation was her constant shadow. Marcus Cromwell thrived on that shadow. The hotelier was a man of ambition and cruelty who barked orders and pinched pennies until they screamed. He kept Bee employed not from charity, but because she cost less than any other maid and accepted insults without protest. His son, Roderick, was worse, a spoiled brute whose lazy charm masked a predator's hunger. For months he had cornered Bee in empty corridors, brushed against her deliberately, whispered threats laced with liquor. Bee learned to avoid the top floor after dusk, but avoidance could not save her on that fateful night when Roderick, drunk and furious, tried to force himself on her in a guest room. She pushed, fought, stumbled, until he cracked his head on a table edge. His roar brought Marcus, and Marcus's fury brought ruin. And so she had stood in the lobby, every eye piercing her, the floor swallowing her dignity. Then came the voice, Donovan MacLeod. To Irondale his name was whispered like a warning. Some said he was a deserter, a killer from the war who had vanished into Stormcrest Mountain with blood still on his hands. Others claimed he had gone mad, building a fortress in the woods and daring any man to trespass. Few had seen him, fewer still had spoken to him. Yet here he stood, broad as an oak, a shadow, turned flesh. His hair was dark, threaded with silver, his face carved by years of wind and battle. Eyes of cold blue swept the room, and in that moment Marcus Cromwell shrank despite the crowd at his back. "I'll not let you spit on her again," Don said, his voice calm, almost quiet, but carrying the weight of command. "She walks out of here under my protection." Bee's knees weakened. She stared at him, bewildered. Why would a stranger, least of all this stranger, stand for her? Cromwell sneered, though his voice cracked. "She's nothing, MacLeod, a servant. You'd risk your neck for the likes of her?" Don's gaze didn't waver. "For her, I'd risk more than my neck. I've risked everything before. This time, I choose who's worth it." A silence heavier than stone filled the lobby. Bee, cheeks wet with tears, could not speak. She only felt his presence like a wall between her and the jeering crowd. For the first time in her life, she wasn't utterly alone. When Don held out his hand, rough and steady, Bee hesitated, then placed her trembling fingers in his palm. Together, they walked out into the cold night, leaving whispers swirling in their wake. The road out of Irondale was dark, the lamps of the Grand Oak fading behind them like the last glimmers of a world Bee wished to forget. She clutched her thin shawl around her shoulders, the night air biting through cloth and skin alike. Her legs trembled, not only from the chill but from the weight of questions swirling inside her. Why had she taken his hand? Why did he, a man she barely knew, risk so much for someone like her? Don walked beside her in silence, each step measured and sure. His rifle rested across his back, his long coat stirring in the autumn wind. He didn't try to touch her, didn't push for words. Instead, he set a pace she could manage, pausing whenever she slowed. Even in silence, his presence steadied her. After a mile, Bee finally spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You shouldn't have interfered. They'll come after you now, after me." "They'll try," Don replied simply. "Let them. You don't understand. Marcus Cromwell, he owns this town. He'll make your life hell." Don's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "I've lived through worse than his kind. A man who hides behind wealth and whispers doesn't frighten me." His calm certainty baffled her. She glanced at him through tear-blurred lashes. In Irondale, no one had ever spoken for her, let alone threatened war on her behalf. The trail climbed, winding into the foothills of Stormcrest. The town's glow dimmed until only the stars lit their way, silver pinpricks scattered across a velvet sky. Bee stumbled on a loose stone, nearly falling. Don's hand shot out, but instead of gripping her, he let his arm hover close, ready to steady her if she wished. "You can take my arm if you want," he offered quietly. Her pride warred with exhaustion. At last she nodded, slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow. His warmth seeped through the thick fabric of his coat, a strange comfort against the night's sharp breath. Hours passed. The mountain loomed higher, trees thickening around them. The scent of pine and damp earth replaced the stench of Irondale smoke. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, and far off, a wolf howled. Bee shivered, pressing closer without meaning to. "You're safe," Don murmured. The words weren't loud, but they sank deep, like an oath etched in stone. By the time they reached a clearing, Bee's feet throbbed. Don halted beside a stream glinting under moonlight. He set down his pack and knelt, striking flint to steel. Sparks caught, and soon a fire crackled to life, painting his face in gold and shadow. "Sit," he instructed gently. "Warm yourself." Bee lowered herself onto a fallen log, holding her hands toward the flames. She hadn't realized how numb her fingers had become until the heat stung them back to life. Don handed her a tin cup of broth from his pack. The savory steam curled into the air, and she hesitated before sipping. It was warm, rich, comfort she hadn't known in years. "Why me?" she asked softly, staring into the flames. "Why fight for me when no one else ever has?" Don crouched across from her, the firelight carving harsh planes into his face. Yet his eyes were steady, unflinching. "Because I've seen battlefields where men more worthy than Cromwell fell while cowards like him thrived. Because I know the look of someone beaten down and told they're nothing. And because I won't stand by and watch it again." Bee blinked rapidly, her throat tightening. No one had ever spoken to her like that, with conviction, not pity. When the fire burned low, Don spread his bedroll a good distance from hers. "Rest," he said. "We've more climbing tomorrow. My cabin's another half-day north." As Bee lay staring at the stars through the branches, exhaustion finally pulling her under, she realized something had shifted. The mountain man beside the fire was not just her rescuer. He was a wall, a shield, and for the first time in her life, she dared to wonder what it might feel like to be worth protecting. By midday the following day, they crested the ridge, and Stormcrest opened before them, a wild expanse of pines, granite cliffs, and the hush of wind sweeping over the peaks. Nestled against the mountainside stood Don's cabin, a sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs, its chimney sending up a steady plume of smoke. Bee paused at the threshold, her breath catching. She had expected something bleak, a hunter's shack barely fit for living. Instead, the cabin felt like a sanctuary. Thick timber walls stood strong against the elements, and inside glowed the light of a stone hearth. A bearskin rug lay stretched before the fire, shelves lined with books and tools filled the corners, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with herbs drying from the rafters. "This is beautiful," Bee whispered, half afraid to step inside. Don held the door open, his voice steady but softer than usual. "It's home, and for as long as you need, it's yours too." He led her to a small side room. A simple bed, neatly made with wool blankets, waited there. A wooden chest sat at its foot, and sunlight streamed through a narrow window. It was more than Bee had ever been given, a room that was hers alone, not a cot in a servant's quarters. She traced her hand over the quilt, her throat tightening. "You'll be comfortable here," Don said, setting down her small bundle of belongings. "If there's anything you need, you tell me." In the days that followed, Bee found herself adjusting to a rhythm she had never known. Each morning, Don stoked the fire before dawn, the scent of coffee filling the air. He always poured her a cup first, setting it beside her with a nod before taking his own. At breakfast, he insisted she eat heartily, brushing aside her protests with quiet certainty. "You've gone too long on scraps," he told her once as she hesitated over a second helping of eggs. "A body needs strength to heal. Don't ever apologize for taking what you need." It was such a simple statement, yet it undid her. In Irondale, she had always been scolded for eating too much, mocked for every bite. Here, food was not shame, but sustenance. During the afternoons, Don showed her the workings of the cabin. Together, they chopped wood, mended the hen house, and hauled water from the spring. His lessons were practical, but his patience never wavered. When Bee struggled to lift an axe, he didn't laugh. He adjusted her stance, guided her grip, and let her feel the satisfying crack of the blade splitting through pine. "Good," he said with a rare smile. "You've got more power in you than you think." That night, as she pulled the quilt around her shoulders, Bee realized she had felt pride, not shame, in her own strength. Evenings became their most cherished hours. Don would sit by the fire, carving small wooden figures or mending gear, while Bee read aloud from one of his books. At first, her voice wavered, uncertain if she was worthy of such company. But Don listened intently, his eyes flicking up from his work to meet hers, a faint warmth softening his storm-colored gaze. "You read beautifully," he told her one night after she set the book aside. "Better than many officers I once commanded." Bee flushed. "Don't mock me." "I've never mocked you," Don said firmly. "Not once." The word settled between them, heavy and certain. Bee looked into the fire, her heart beating strangely fast. Small gestures began to weave threads of trust between them. Don always made sure she ate first at supper. He mended a tear in her skirt without being asked. On the coldest nights, he discreetly placed an extra log on the fire outside her room so the chill never reached her bed. None of it was spoken aloud, yet each act whispered, "You are worth the care." For the first time in her life, Bee began to believe it. Still, doubt lingered in the quiet hours. One evening, as snowflakes tapped gently against the window, she found herself whispering, "I don't know why you bother with me." Don looked up from his chair, setting aside the knife he'd been sharpening. His gaze was steady, his voice low. "Because you matter. Because you've been treated like nothing your whole life, and that's a lie I intend to erase." Bee turned away, tears pricking her eyes. She didn't answer, but deep inside, something fragile and long-buried stirred. As the days stretched into weeks, Irondale and its cruelty felt further away. The cabin, with its crackling hearth and steady rhythm, became more than shelter. It became a place where Bee was no longer invisible, where she was seen, where she might, just might, learn how to be loved. Winter had settled thick across Stormcrest by the time whispers from Irondale clawed their way up the mountain. Snow buried the trail, but trouble had a way of finding passage. It began with a letter, slipped under the cabin door one icy morning. Don found it first, his jaw tightening as he read the sprawling script. Bea watched his hands curl into fists. "What is it?" she asked. Don hesitated, then handed it over. The words leapt off the page like venom. "Beatrice Sullivan is a criminal who assaulted the heir of Grand Oak. She hides in the company of a dangerous deserter. Return her, or face the law." Bea's chest constricted. "They'll never stop, will they? Cromwell will hound me until I'm ruined." Don's voice was like iron striking steel. "Then let him come. I've fought bigger tyrants than Marcus Cromwell." But Bea heard what Don didn't say, that a town's law could crush even the strongest man. She stared at the fire, her confidence draining away. In the silence that followed, Don spoke again, his tone softer. "There's something you don't know about me." Bea looked up. His face was carved with shadows, as if he'd carried the weight of this moment for years. I wasn't just an officer, he said slowly. I commanded men during the war. And I left. Walked away when I realized the men giving orders were cowards, sending boys to die for gold and politics. Some called me a deserter, others, traitor. Bee's breath caught. The word hung between them sharp as a blade. Is it true? Don's eyes, storm blue and unyielding, met hers. I left, yes, but not because I lacked courage. Because I refused to fight for men who saw soldiers as expendable. I'll live with that stain the rest of my life. For a moment, Bee's old instincts, fear, doubt, shame, screamed inside her. She, a woman despised for her body, and he, a man condemned for defiance. What chance did they have against a world that thrived on their ruin? Yet she remembered the way he had split wood at her side, the way he listened when she read, the way he never mocked her hunger or her tears. You chose conscience over obedience, she said softly. That doesn't make you a coward. It makes you human. His shoulders eased just slightly. And you? Do you still believe you're not worth fighting for? Bee swallowed hard, her throat thick. Every voice in Irondale told me I wasn't. But when I'm here with you, her voice faltered, I almost believe I am. Don reached across the fire, his large hand covering hers. Then let me help you believe it all the way. Before the moment could deepen, a sound shattered the quiet, the distant echo of hooves on frozen ground. Don was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Stay inside, he ordered, his voice dropping into the clipped command of a soldier. Through the frosted window, Bee saw dark figures threading their way up the mountain path. At their head rode a scarred man with a crooked hat, Jake Morrison, a name Don had once spoken with contempt. Morrison was a mercenary, a vulture who fed on the coin of desperate men, and Bee knew without asking who had hired him. Fear clawed through her chest. They've come for me? No, Don growled, steadying his rifle as snowflakes swirled like ash outside. They've come for us, and that was their first mistake. Snow fell thick and fast, smothering the mountain in silence, until the first shot cracked through the night. The bullet slammed into the cabin's outer wall, splinters flying. Bea gasped, pressing herself against the hearth as Don moved with the calm precision of a man who had lived through too many battles. Down! He barked, shoving a rifle into her hands. Stay low. Aim only if you must. Bee's fingers trembled around the weapon, but she nodded. This was no longer the helpless maid of Irondale. This was a woman with something and someone to protect. The gang stormed through the tree line, torches blazing. Morrison's scarred face twisted into a grin as he called out, "McLeod, hand over the girl, and maybe we'll leave you breathing." Don flung the door open, his silhouette framed against the firelight. His voice thundered across the snow. "If you want her, you'll have to kill me first, and I promise I won't go down easy." Gunfire erupted. Don moved like a shadow, each shot deliberate, each step measured. 2 men fell in the snow, their torches snuffed out. Morrison cursed, spurring his men forward. Inside, Bee's heart pounded. Through the window, she saw one of the mercenaries creeping toward Don's blind side. Panic surged, but so did resolve. She threw open the window, raised the rifle the way Don had taught her, and fired. The shot rang true. The man crumpled, his weapon skittering across the ice. Don glanced back just long enough to meet her eyes. In that fleeting second, pride burned in his gaze. Not pity, pride. The fight raged on. Flames from the torches licked at the snow, smoke stinging Bee's eyes. Morrison lunged from the shadows, his knife flashing as he charged at Don. The two men collided, steel against steel, their grunts echoing in the storm. Bee's chest clenched, every instinct screamed to hide. But instead, she seized the poker from the hearth and ran into the fray. "Don!" she cried. Morrison turned, snarling, but too late. Bee swung with all the strength she had, the iron rod cracking across his arm. His knife spun into the snow. Don seized the opening, slamming Morrison down and pressing his blade to the man's throat. The mercenaries froze, their leader pinned, their courage shattered. They scattered into the dark woods. Silence fell at last, broken only by the ragged sound of Bee's breathing. Don rose slowly, blood on his knuckles, snow in his hair. He turned to Bee, his voice rough but steady. "You saved me." Bee clutched the poker, her chest heaving. "No," she whispered. "We saved each other." By the time the last torchlight vanished into the trees, the storm had swallowed the night. Don shut the cabin door and dropped the bar across it. The two of them stood in the silence, their breaths clouding the cold air, the smell of smoke and gunpowder still clinging to their clothes. Bee's hand shook, but not from fear. She looked at Don, tall and fierce in the firelight, and realized she had fought at his side and lived. For the first time in her life, she felt not like a burden, but like a partner. Don crossed the room slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. He touched her hand, the gentleness in his rough palms undoing her. "You were brave tonight," he said quietly, "braver than most men I've ever served with." Tears stung Bee's eyes. "I was terrified." His thumb brushed her knuckles. "So was I. That's what courage is, Bee, doing it anyway." The fire snapped, shadows dancing across the walls. She leaned closer, her voice breaking. "Am I safe here? Truly?" Don's eyes softened, storm to see. "Safe and wanted. This is your home now, if you'll have it." The words wrapped around her like the warmest quilt. She nodded, tears spilling freely. For the first time in years, she felt the truth of it. She was worth fighting for. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the whispers of Irondale and whatever battles still waited beyond the ridge. But inside, in the glow of the cabin, a woman and a man sat together by the fire, their hands entwined. The question lingered in the crackle of the flames. Was their love strong enough to defy the world beyond these mountains? Every time I share a story like Bee and Don's, I'm reminded that love is not about perfection, but about protection, trust, and the courage to stand together when the world turns cruel. Their journey shows us that every soul is worth fighting for, no matter what others say. I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you still believe in love strong enough to defy the world, don't go anywhere. The next story is waiting for you.